Well, hi, everybody. Hope the afternoon sessions were as good as the morning sessions. I'm sure they were, even though we don't seem to be quite as crowded. So I notice everyone's kind of sitting near the door, or maybe in the back. I think we're not going to let you escape, right? If I could encourage you, we're going to be here. Okay, so what I'd like to do, we're going to close with a bang here. We've got a wonderful panel from OMB, and I'd like actually just to introduce Dan Chenok, who's a long time at OMB, knows everything, where all the bodies are and all that, and he's going to introduce our OMB panel to us. So enjoy this. It should be great.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Dan.
Welcome. So, in fact, this panel has a bit of Charles Dickens in it. So I am here as the ghost of OMB past. Our esteemed, fantastic panel, the ghost of OMB present. Somewhere out there, one among you is surely the ghost of OMB management yet to come. So welcome to the panel. We are really excited to end this year's Acquisition Excellence Conference with a discussion around how acquisition fits into the broader management reform priorities of the administration that we've all been reading about. Many of us have been participating in agencies and supportive agencies, and we have just a tremendous panel of leaders to lead us through that. Let me just introduce them briefly. Many of them are well known to you, but starting to my right, Dustin Brown. Dustin is the Acting Deputy Director for Management and the Director of the Office of Performance and Personnel Management. So he's wearing doing two different jobs at the moment and carrying them both very well. Dustin's a longtime OMB colleague and has served many roles in the agency, has seen multiple reform initiatives through multiple administrations as well, and brings great perspective and leadership to that role. So thank you, Dustin. Margie Graves, as all of you know, is the Deputy Federal Chief Information Officer and the Acting Federal Chief Information Officer in the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer, a job that I have some passing familiar with in a past life. And Margie came to OMB having had a very distinguished career at the Department of Homeland Security as the Deputy Chief Information Officer there, as well as a number of other senior information technology executive roles. Margie, of course, also wears a hat as the past chair of the American Council for Technology. So terrific to welcome you here, Margie.
Thank you.
And then Joni Newhart, who many of you in the acquisition community have worked with and learned from over many years, as have I, is the Associate Administrator for Federal Procurement Policy. Joni is stepping in for Leslie Field, who could not make it today. But Joni, as we know, brings great insight, also brings the perspective of agencies, having been the Senior Procurement Executive at the Department of Transportation and the Small Business Administration. So we have multiple perspectives from both present and past roles. And we're going to start by talking about a few questions around the current management reform initiatives, how acquisition fits in, and then we'll look forward to your questions and comments as well. So the theme of today's conference is acquisition is a team sport. And you're leading the OMB management team in this area. Dustin, if you could start, talk about the collective priorities of the management team under the Executive Order and Memorandum 1722, which is, of course, the OMB implementing guidance for government reform, and reflect a little bit on how acquisition reform fits into those priorities.
Sure. Well, thanks. It's great to be with everyone here today, and look forward to hearing some questions as well as we kind of move through this. It's been really fascinating to be able to work with all the different communities, whether financial management, the CIO community, Chief Financial Officer community, and now procurement as well. I think active engagement from all of those is going to be really critical going forward. One of the things I think that we identify as a priority right from the beginning is to really make sure that there was good buy-in and ownership on the set of reform ideas and proposals that we want to work to achieve over the next several months and years. And really, to be able to do that, we wanted to start the process off with getting the best ideas that we could find from wherever they exist. And I think giving kind of agencies an opportunity to really send in their best ideas. Hopefully, they're taking the initiative to engage their workforce and you all to enlist your thoughts on the best ideas that you've seen, so that we really do have a bottoms-up process as much as possible. We've also engaged with outside groups on what those priorities and proposals should be, including Congress. We've asked them for their ideas to be included as part of the considerations that we're kind of including right now as we set priorities. So I do think that process point is a really important one because how we kind of move out from OMB and engaging with others, I think oftentimes can be the difference between having a successful set of priorities and reform ideas versus something that gets cooked up with just a few of us and then try to drive out without the real benefit of everyone's experience. So that, I think, is the first thing I'd say. Second thing before I let people speak a little bit more to some of the acquisition-specific priorities is, in the very first kind of skinny budget, as they called it, there was, I think, a pretty good description of what some of the initial priorities are for the President's management agenda. And I know that was early and they were pretty broad, but I do think it sent an important signal that management will be a key focal point of this administration's efforts to make government more effective and efficient. And really laid out four, and I'll just kind of highlight them quickly. The first really is around mission delivery and looking at how we better deliver those programs, especially those that are direct kind of interactions with customers and citizens. And there's obviously a lot of work that's been done to improve how we set goals in that space, and I expect a lot of that to continue. The second key priority that we identified was how do we reduce kind of low-value, burdensome activities, and we even gave ourselves an initial deadline to see what things OMB could identify that potentially are requirements that are forcing low-value activities, reporting burden that we could scale back, and I would expect to see something very soon on kind of a down payment on that effort, but we expect that to be an ongoing effort. I know each of the different CXO councils and communities are in the process of identifying things that we could streamline, things that we could maybe make less frequent, things we could stop doing in order to help free up resources and capacity to focus on those higher value-add, more mission-focused or mission support-focused activities. The third is the area that I think each of the different communities will really play a key part in formulating how we better improve the effectiveness and the costs of our mission support functions, whether that's a procurement, hiring, financial management. I think there's pretty broad agreement that a lot of the processes that support the mission delivery need to be greatly improved. I know there's a lot of focus on shared services and category management, a number of other opportunities that we need to be looking at government-wide, but also agency-specific efforts. For instance, we have benchmarking data that really gives us, for the first time, better insight into where those mission support services are shown to be effective from a manager standpoint and where we need to really focus our attention. So I think setting goals in that space will be critical. And then the last one that was identified kind of as an overarching priority of the management agenda will be, how we go about tracking and holding people accountable for delivery on those. And that's an area that I'm pleased to say this administration has agreed to mainly use the kind of statutory framework that was developed back in 2010 with the GIPRA Modernization Act that will have a set of cross-agency priority goals, agency-specific priority goals, and then broad set of strategic goals and objectives that will be included as part of each agency's strategic plan. So I think having some continuity on that standpoint is actually a pretty important thing so that we aren't kind of constantly reinventing how we track these, but actually kind of leveraging the framework that Congress and the executive branch have agreed is the structure that we can use to set goals and measure our progress against them.
Thanks, Dustin. Margie, any additional thoughts?
Well, I think what we've all been considering as we've been talking through those priorities that Dustin just outlined is the fact that the Reform EO is really the overarching umbrella for a number of reform initiatives and streamlining initiatives and process improvement initiatives that we're doing across the CXO community. So when you think of the Reform EO, all of the agencies, we were lucky enough to be in a PMC meeting just recently where you're starting to see agencies come together and actually look at what they might do together and common portfolios. So for example, NASA and NSF and DOE, we're looking at, okay, how do we deliver science? How do we deliver the activities of laboratories? How do we deliver some of our mission areas? And what comes right behind that is how do we finance it effectively, and how do we put acquisition strategies in place that would actually support that happening? So when you think about the lab of the future and how these entities might work together in a new reformed manner, acquisition always plays into that. So I consider the Reform EO and the way that we've all talked about it as kind of the strategic umbrella for how you deliver your business or your mission. And I'm hoping that people are seeing, as we're out talking about it, that we're trying to connect the dots from other EOs into that equation, including the cyber EO, including some others that are coming down the pike, so that people connect those dots and you see the same repeated strategies in every document with perhaps a little bit of a different lens. So when I think of it from the IT perspective, I'm looking for those shared services and those enterprise approaches and those common capabilities that would allow us to either consolidate or improve or streamline. And those all require funding and acquisition strategies. So you can see how it all melds together over time.
Great. Joni?
Yeah, so we're looking at this as a really big opportunity for the acquisition function in an agency to show that it can really add strategic value to accomplishing the agency mission. And so we've been trying to help the agencies kind of think through how they might approach this reform effort. We set up a web page with a bunch of resources we thought would help. Mostly we're trying to stay out of the way, but give them a chance to talk to each other. So we've kind of bucketed things they might think about into 3 sections. So organization, should I be centralizing more? Should I send more people out to the field? Should I incorporate category management strategies? That's one. Number 2 is the processes. So we have the FAR, which everybody loves, I know. And then there's agency supplements. There's bureau supplements. Maybe there's office supplements. So do we really need all of that? No, I don't think so. And the last part is the people part, my personal favorite. So do we have the right people with the right skills at the right place? So the leaders are looking at their whole organization. You know, how many 1105s do I have? How many GS7s? How many GS13s? Is that the right mix? They haven't really had an opportunity to look at it before now. I know maybe they've wanted to, but there hasn't been the appetite. So now's a perfect opportunity to do it, and we're seeing that they're doing it and they're sharing ideas. It's really a wonderful process to watch.
Thanks, Jenny. So great insights on the government work to date. There's also a public input piece of the reform agenda, and yesterday was the closing of the formal public comment period, where you got many thousands, I think, ideas from the public on government reform. What are the next steps in this process? And thinking about the acquisition community being government and industry working together, how can they continue to contribute to that process?
So this is a perfect example of government industry getting together. We had an outreach session, break session on myth busting. So we had a really vigorous conversation on government industry, and I want to encourage all of you to keep talking as you talk. The industry talks to your customers, and the acquisition organization reaches out. What are the pain points? You know, what are the things that are causing you trouble that we can help on the government side, that you can help on the industry side? So the more that we can have those conversations, I think the closer we'll get to our end goal of improving government.
Yeah, and you're right, we got over 100,000 public comments submitted in, and as part of that process, the individuals needed to identify which agency they were focusing on with respect to their comments. They could select multiple, And so we have gone through and made sure, with a huge help from Margie's team, to help us actually organize that in a consumable way. I think the first version had a spreadsheet with about 5,000 columns, and that wasn't going to work.
It wasn't user-friendly.
So her team surged and got the IT kind of configuration right so that we could actually send them to the agencies in a way that they could consume. And so we did overcome that and have been sending in different batches to an agency point of contact who's responsible for receiving the public comments, so that they each get their own specific sets. And, supposed to be looking at those as they are looking for ideas. I know most agencies, as I mentioned before, are also engaging with their own workforce and have different work groups kind of organized, sometimes around common goals, to be able to come together. And some people are reporting that's the first time they've gotten certain SES together who actually work in somewhat related areas and are yielding good ideas, and they're excited about finding mechanisms to make sure there's an ongoing way for that to happen, so it's not just about a plan, right, or a report, but this really does try to transform the way that we operate as a government to have a more systemic way of getting feedback from the front lines, from employees, managers, outside groups. So that's kind of the process on the public comment. I would also note the executive order on reorg also put OMB as the responsible entity for looking at those issues that cut across multiple agencies. So we've also undertaken an effort to get input from outside groups, from agencies, from different organizations to inform things that cut across multiple agencies. And so we now have a pretty healthy list of those assembled, over a couple hundred, that we're sorting through and beginning to narrow that down so that we can focus in on development of those then, which will lead into the fall budget process for final kind of consideration and inclusion in the FY19 budget. So yeah, I think we're in pretty good shape, but as we like to say, the getting ideas stage is the easy part. Going through those ideas and actually kind of prioritizing and having some criteria to choose which ones we really focus on, obviously it takes a lot of effort.
So you're going to see some of these themes that come out of these cross-cutting initiatives that are coming into OMB, and I think we're going to narrow it down to what are the most common ones. And when those actually get communicated and published, I would encourage agencies and industry to start discussing those together as customer and customer support. The open conversations that Joni just talked about, one of the things we used to do at DHS, and we've got another one upcoming, is called a Reverse Industry Day. And that's where we turn the tables and we have industry tell us through panels how we can more effectively work with them to deliver on our mission space. And I find those open conversations other opportunities to surface best practices and approaches similar to the ones that we're talking about in the Reform EO. I think that will just be another type of source you can do individually with your customers. Also, I found talking with my primary vendors and developing product roadmaps. Most of you who are out in the industry realm have these product roadmaps and long-term views of where you're trying to take your corporations. And the more that we can have those open conversations and align whatever we need in terms of our requirements and in terms of what we see coming down the pike and what our biggest challenges are to what your product roadmap foresees in the future, the better off we will all be. The final thing is, in terms of R&D and venture capital, working with those communities within your corporations as to how you would actually direct and use R&D over the long term, and then ultimately middlemen like In-Q-Tel and others who actually collect ideas from the entire community and then bring it back to the acquisition space. I think you'll see all of that flow seamlessly because you'll see the strategic view from the reform, you'll see the signal of what we're trying to pursue. That'll translate into product roadmaps and then ultimately into investment. So we're hoping that all comes together and that we're going to give ourselves an acceleration into the future by doing that.
That's a great point, Margie. And of course, ACT-IAC with its communities of interest and the Institute for Innovation can
Right.
play a bit of a force multiplier role in that conversation as well. I'm sure many of the folks here will be part of that. Stepping back and kind of taking a longer view, the current reform initiative continues a progression of reforms that acquisition has been a core part of really for the last 20 years. You think back, you had the OFP Administrator Steve Kellman in the 1990s, who created a significant acquisition reform agenda. Acquisition was a core element of the President's management agenda in the Bush administration. And of course, digital became a key part of acquisition reform in the last administration. If you sort of think about the lessons learned going in the past and then think forward, what are some of the core priorities of acquisition reform as part of the overall management reform initiatives?
So it's interesting. I have had a pretty long career, as you can tell from all my gray hair. I've earned it all. But so
Not me.
some of the challenges that we had when I started my career, we still have had them today, and it's kind of remarkable to look back and see that. So that's why this is such a good opportunity to say, okay, stop. Let's really work on simplifying things, reducing the burden on all sides. Are you doing things that are unnecessary? This is our opportunity to do it. I've seen things in my career as I've come up the ladder that I wanted to do that I could see were inefficient and were terrible practices, but there was no stomach to do it at the agency for whatever reason. Now we have that mandate. So I think going forward, it's different, that we're going to make some improvements. I'm very hopeful that we will.
So the kinds of things that I see coming down the pike, and we see it now, and I'll talk about it in the guise of shared services. We know that we need shared services. We need them badly. We need them delivered effectively. They're a key part of our strategy for modernizing IT. But ultimately, we need to send a demand signal to the commercial marketplace, because we just don't have enough capacity within the federal government, even supported by commercial entities, to deliver on that promise. So we're going to have to expand the marketplace and get into a more open conversation about standards-based products and standard-based software as a service, so that we can actually expand the opportunities that we have to adopt these kinds of platforms going forward, because we're not going to have the opportunity to go big on this unless we do. Also, streamlining the access, so all of the things that Joni talked about that frustrate her about actually getting to the contracting and getting to the product. The reforms that we're undertaking in the process itself are supposed to eliminate some of those barriers to access. So the way that we talk through our requirement setting, the way that we have the customer constantly at the table in an agile fashion, constantly in the process, and then ultimately the kinds of contractual elements that we put into the contracts themselves that allow us to adjust as things adjust during a life cycle. Those are going to be huge. And then finally, I think bringing in more players. I mean, we've got a lot of good, solid companies that are in the delivery space in government IT, and we need to bring more into the equation. So our ability to get new companies and the R&D projects from our favorite companies into the mix in a more rapid fashion, including rapid prototyping, things of that nature, all very important to how we move forward.
Yeah, and just kind of taking a step back and where we are right now, and like Dan and others, a student of kind of some of the past management reform efforts. One of the things that I think is becoming increasingly clear is we need to be able to work both on the horizontal and the vertical dimensions. On the horizontal, there's a kind of popular saying that we have horizontal problems and we have vertical organizations, and how we collectively work together to be able to overcome that dynamic, I think, is a really important thing that will be key to our success. I know we have a big opportunity to not just kind of identify these horizontal kind of challenges, but actually, to Margie and Joni's point, deliver horizontal solutions that actually can be leveraged by multiple agencies. And I think some of the opportunities we have going forward in the shared service space or category management spaces really are about not just putting out a policy, but actually how do we deliver real capabilities that can be leveraged by agencies. And I think, the pace at which technology is changing and capabilities are emerging that can meet those needs is something that we should feel encouraged by. On the vertical, I think there's been kind of long-standing identification of, people in DC focus on policy, budget, communications, legislation. The 85% of the workforce that's in the field is where the implementation happens, and we don't probably build enough bridges to really make sure that there's good communication from the front lines to DC and then, back out to the field. And I think the data that we have today really offers an opportunity to overcome some of those maybe traditional barriers to communication. I look at something like the Employee Viewpoint Survey, which, as Dan and others know, I'm rather passionate about, which went from about 400 organizational breakouts. So you used to get just the bureau level kind of data. Now we have 28,000 organizational breakouts that really take you down to the field and to the team, almost work level unit. That is some very powerful, actionable data that I think give people in leadership positions much better insight into culture, and other kind of key employee engagement issues, and a wide variety of information that could be used as part of a lot of these reform efforts to really kind of target where there are potential issues that need management attention, as well as where our real successes are, and building on and leveraging that. And I think it's going to take all of those things kind of coming together, both the horizontal but also kind of the vertical dimension, if we're going to truly make the kind of progress that I think the public, expects of this sort of work.
Interesting perspectives. A number of you have talked about technology and its role in management reform as an enabler. And of course, last year, this community has seen the implementation of the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act, or FTARA. And now we have in Congress the Modernizing Government Technology Act, which would introduce funding flexibilities and create opportunities for using money in different ways to identify acquisitions and reform initiatives through technology. How can funding flexibilities like those in the MGT Act change the game in terms of going forward and leveraging technology effectively?
Well, I'm really excited about the possibility that this is going to actually pass. We've, of course, invested close to 2.5 years in the process. What we always knew was that if you couldn't get the seed money and if you couldn't get the financial uplift, that it was very difficult for agencies to, quote, modernize within their top line when their top line is constantly decreasing. They're actually, stuck in place, almost, bicycling in place in the sense of not being able to have the capital investment necessary to move forward. And now we're moving from CapEx to OpEx, so I think what we can do is we can leverage every dollar toward those services in the service economy, and we can go much further and much faster. The other thing that MGT does is it provides an opportunity to look at portfolio views. So if you're looking across, I'll give an example from DHS, if you're looking across DHS and the State Department and Department of Justice and other agencies that we work very closely with where we have unified business processes. If you look at those end to end and if you bring a unified business case to the management fund, you can possibly modernize all the pieces and parts of that equation instead of separately going and making your case within your own budget. One of them possibly gets through, one of them doesn't, and then holistically you don't have the entire end-to-end business process. So that's an opportunity for the fund. And then finally, for funding migrations to these actual enterprise services and getting enough money into the equation, somewhat like we did with CDM, of, we're going to have a fund that's actually going to support you in moving to these unified services. Again, because it's not something that's supplied in your agency budget. And to go forward and ask for it individually is a much tougher road to go.
Okay. So last question, and then we'll open it up to, for questions from the audience. So each of you has been a leader in this presidential transition, and you've done the same role in the past, potentially in different agencies, not necessarily at OMB. What have you learned about the process and engaging during a time of transition that government and industry can learn from in terms of collaborating for management reform and acquisition success? Or what is it about transitions that provides an opportunity for people to really engage?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it gives you a chance to really be, transparent and forthcoming about what's working and what's not. And I think that's a really important thing as a career civil servant to just always be very honest about. And I think, again, some of the feedback mechanisms that we have now give us a much better visibility into what strategies are working. I think engagement with our respective communities is really important because, it's one thing if OMB's out there kind of saying, oh, yeah, this process is working great when, our collective agencies are saying the opposite. So making sure that there's also a real honest conversation with our different kind of CXO counterparts in the agencies and good alignment, or if there's not alignment, we understand why that might be the case and have a mechanism to have that discussion during the transition time. I think we've all tried to leverage that as an opportunity to really kind of do a stock taking of where we are, what problems do we have. Let's be really honest about those, own them as much as possible, and try to devise some strategies for how to overcome them, and potentially looking at new things that haven't been tried before, or solutions that we've seen maybe work in one agency that could be expanded elsewhere. So I've always kind of viewed them as rather exciting opportunities to put some of that fresh thinking out there, but also being really, really clear about what is the problem we're trying to solve, and start that right from the beginning. That's something that I'd say, I remember during the Bush administration and the scorecard days, I mean, they were very clear up front about what their standards of success were. And by the way, everybody was red on all of those standards of success. But then, there was 7-8 years of focus on how do you get to green relative to those standards, and had a process for updating it. And I think we've continued to kind of evolve in our tools that we use, because this is an area, fortunately, that is pretty bipartisan. There is a lot of agreement from across the political spectrum, and including on the Hill with our oversight committees, with HISGAC and Hogar. I think a real agreement on kind of what the problems are, and a genuine desire to give people more tools and more capabilities to overcome them.
I think there's an opportunity whenever you see the transition open up. Everybody's learning. People are coming to the table without hopefully preconceived notions. So there's an opportunity to put everything back on the table. So these things that we talked about that we thought were going to go one way and they didn't quite go that way, we can actually put them back on the table and get some other folks into the conversation, especially those that are coming in who don't yet feel constrained by some of the things that sometimes we let ourselves be constrained by. And we need to break a few rice bowls and understand what that means to affect that change. I'm seeing, some pretty open conversations that are happening, and particularly around the concept of good government. Good government, I know it's been in my particular discipline in IT. There aren't too many people who argue with the effective delivery of services and capabilities in IT. It is a nonpartisan approach, and it's something that I think has been openly discussed. They're bringing a lot of big-name CEOs to the table. There were a lot of documents that were produced even before the administration changed on, okay, if I could start with where I am today and I could change 4 or 5 things, what would those be, and what do I think the outcome is possible that we could achieve. So the art of the possible papers, I saw a lot of those coming from industry. I see a lot of them coming from good government groups. And now, through the reform process. We're seeing them coming from individual agencies, which is probably the most important part of the equation, because there's no one who knows what goes on a daily basis with boots on the ground other than the people that are actually doing it. So if you add those three together, there's a huge opportunity to have that conversation and to select a few things and really drive them.
Yeah, from my perspective, I really like the fact that it's a time for reflection and kind of really thinking about things. A lot of times you're going 100 miles an hour, but it seems to be a little pause where you can reset things to their point. The other thing is it's challenging in a way because I see a lot of my colleagues and people at the agencies, they're scared because they don't know what's going to happen. But again, I think it's a good opportunity for change and for something new and for something better. So try and reassure them, and also for them to be part of the equation, to weigh in. So I encourage each of you to go think of the one thing that bugs you the most and go back to your agency and bring it up to your boss and see what happens. If we all in this room did it, that'd be a lot more good ideas. And finally, and I hope this stays in the room, I like the opportunity to kind of be under the radar where people are so focused on all these other things. We just can kind of do our good government things while they're all figuring this out.
All right. So on that note, questions for this tremendous panel?
Uh-oh, it's late in the
It's a
afternoon.
long day.
Is it good lunch?
It's a long day. Yep, back here.
I understand there's an interest in OMB and a plan to...
The mic's coming. So.
I understand there's an interest in OMB and possibly a plan to use the approach called technology business management for CPIC. Obviously, it's a little bit better than OPEX and CAPEX as two overall categories. What do you think is the time frame that's needed to make that useful narrowly to CPIC and possibly more broadly for something like the MGT?
This is a very important initiative that we've just begun the journey to actually implement. We worked for the last 2 years with industry to develop a common taxonomy of how you would actually describe IT cost and how you would collect those costs in a standard manner so that you could actually understand where you stood on capability delivery and operational efficiency and all of the questions that you would normally ask yourself to understand if you're actually operating an effective business. It's not rocket science, but it's so foundational and key to what we're trying to accomplish in the following manner. We just had the soft launch of the Data Act, which has been 3 years in implementation. And very, very difficult to get that cross-referencing among the agencies, but it has actually happened. We do have transparency. We have it at an object class level that's pretty high. What we're trying to do with TBM is to go specifically into the IT space and get into the subject class code and actually go one step further. So we're in discussions right now through Mark Rieger, who's not here with us today, and the CFO community as to what are the possibilities on how we might do that and how do we use, most importantly, and I told my folks from the very beginning, this is not an IT thing with a finance flavor. It's a financial thing with an IT flavor. And what we've got to do is we've got to work effectively through the CFO community and the Department of Treasury and the Data Act to see how we can use currently existing processes on how they change what I would consider in private sector the general ledger to be able to implement what we're trying to implement. We think that this will take time. In talking with our private sector counterparts, I just returned from the TBM annual meeting where there were companies that have actually implemented this process. And they talked about their challenges and their successes along that journey. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring them in to a forum to talk in a White House forum about this in general. But what I've heard from every one of them are two things. First of all, just start, okay, because you're not going to get it perfect out of the box. It's not going to give you everything you want right out of the box. but just get started. And secondarily, don't expect it to be done overnight. So we're talking 2-3 years if we're really accelerating, maybe a little bit longer, but we've got to get started. And the reason why we've got to get started is I can't go into senior management and say 80% of my cost is in the bucket called other. Okay? And how can I make decisions off of that? And as we're going into our approach for the mock board to actually decide which business cases get funding from the Technology Modernization Fund, or even if you're doing that within your agencies and you're trying to decide what your trade-offs are, you can't do that without a baseline. And you can't do that without being able to measure off that baseline as to whether or not the modernization effort that you actually did not only achieved the outcomes, but also achieved the financial success that you're talking about. So we're committed to it. We have to make it happen.
Good. Other questions? Over here?
What is being done to measure the effectiveness of cyber investments? If everybody's working as a team, you are buying, spending a lot of money on a lot of tools, how do you measure the effectiveness of them to make sure that your investments make sense?
All right, I can tell you what I've taken as an approach myself, and this is one of the things that we're trying to instill in terms of cyber, and that is managing risk. And you'll see in the cyber EO, as well as the risk management approach, A123, is that what it's called?
A123.
A123? Okay, so sometimes I don't get the numbers right, but I know what the content is. So trying to take a risk-managed approach, because you are never going to be all the way over to the right in terms of 100% implemented on some of these checklists that we talk about, but understanding your own environment and understanding what needs to be protected and in what manner allows you to manage the risk. And by assigning a responsible official for that risk management within the Cyber EO, we are asking agencies to come forth with a risk management plan. Again, should be connected to your reform, should be connected to all the other things you're doing, to articulate within that risk management plan how every dollar will be applied to buying down that risk. And the risk profile for each entity is going to be a little different. So it's not one size fits all. They're not going to all look the same. I know that Chip Fulgham, I think who spoke here earlier today, who was not only our Deputy Undersecretary for Management, was also our CFO. He used to tell me, okay, show me how I connect every dollar to buying down my risk. And the measure of success is hard sometimes because it's hard to measure things that don't happen. But there are a few ways to do that, and we're exploring, trying to constantly get better, staying within the NIST framework, measuring the right things, not using checklists, talking about outcomes. These are all the risk management approaches that we're trying to put in place, and tying the dollars back to that is one of the key elements.
And there are clear methodologies in the private sector for measuring impact of cyber investments and cyber risk, that as the Cyber EO, which really sets in motion a number of reviews over the next 6 to 9 months,
yes,
right?
It does.
As the results of those reviews start to come out and sort of circulate in the community, I think it's incumbent on all of us to help bring forward those methodologies as the government sort of identifies what are the key priorities and how do you measure success from those priorities. So we've had 2 questions from this side of the room. Anybody from over here? Up front.
Thank you. My question was about shared services. So there's been a lot of discussion about shared services and kind of the continuing embracing of that in terms of systems and technology as a software and its various different platforms. Can any of you speak at all to the approach about labor as a service, whether that's through federal providers or industry providers, assisted acquisition, for instance. Is that going to be incorporated into part of the management agenda on shared services?
That's a good question. I think we're open to what makes sense, so we certainly will be looking at that as well as all other aspects of how we can get the most bang for the buck. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I would just say as a broad theme, we're hearing shared services as a really, really important issue to tackle as part of the reform and the President's management agenda. I think we are getting as many kind of suggestions and on that topic as any that we're seeing. So I do think it has to do with this underlying issue I mentioned before around people's general satisfaction with the quality of their hiring processes, of their procurement, financial management, IT, and the recognition that there is a lot of frustration out there that those processes aren't better supporting mission performance and managers. And we do see through the benchmarking data quite a variety of kind of feedback that we're getting in each agency and variations within agencies, right? It looks very different depending on what bureau you might be in, both in terms of cost as well as in terms of satisfaction. And so I do think it gives us better insights into where some of those pain points might be and where our successes are. But we do have a kind of an imbalance between supply and demand right now. There's a real demand for improvement, but I think we are still looking at the supply end and where we can try to marry those two up. So welcome suggestions from this group on any of that, because I do think it'll be a pretty key part of what we wind up moving forward with.
Yeah, I know that ACT-IAC held the Shared Services Forum for a number of years and still has that as a focus of one of the communities of interest. So hopefully some good ideas coming from folks here.